Hi, this is James, and for this video, what I want to talk about is nostalgia bait artists and just in general, nostalgia bait in music. And the reason why I'm making this is because I feel like it's something that's becoming more and more present and accepted as something that's just a reality of how music is going to progress. Because nostalgia bait, I should clarify, is by no means a new thing. One of my favorite eras of like nostalgia music is the whole 50s revival in like horrorcore punk psychobilly stuff. I mean, it kind of, I don't want to say it begins, but it gains the most prominence with like Misfits and the Cramps. And they do very much this homage almost to a lot to Elvis and a lot to just in general 50s rock music and doing these whole like 50s sci-fi. Everything's very much nostalgia. It gives you a space to live in. But even in the late 80s, early 90s, there's movies that come out that are based in the 50s. You also have groups like the Cherry Poppin' Daddies and stuff like that is very much nostalgia bait. But the difference is that those weren't dominating the culture the way that current nostalgia bait artists kind of do. And I'm not talking about like artists in the monocle. Like obviously like Taylor Swift isn't a nostalgia bait artist at all, but Silk Sonic, Bruno Mars, you know, one of the biggest artists in the world, did a full like year and a half, 2 years where all he was doing was just this like reference and pastiche to a lot of old Motown artists, to a lot of old soul artists, and kind of reawakening a lot of that sound for a new audience. And it wasn't reinventing the wheel by any means. It was just kind of presenting this thing that people weren't really alive for, but could be nostalgic for. And I don't think that's wrong, but I do think it's just indicative of this sort of stalemate going on in music culture that's kind of allowing things like that to be successful because it feels like there's a lack of progress. And I'm not saying that there is a lack of progress. I want to emphasize I'm saying it's a feeling of a lack of progress. And it kind of contributes to a general feeling that's being shown in like Gen Z and Gen Alpha. I'm sure we'll experience it even more, which is just the idea that there's nothing that can be done to progress things. And it's a very, defeated, in some ways nihilistic or pessimistic mindset. And it comes from just a general sense of being jaded about the future. It's kind of like what Gen X had in the 90s, where they were like, we're not going to make as much as our parents, so let's make grunge music. But I mean, like that, it sounds overly simplistic, but it's kind of how things were. People were broke, so they made music that was easy to make. It just required a cheap amp and a guitar, and you could dress using thrifted clothes, and that was considered to be like cool in that culture, and grunge culture. When there is a cultural movement in this way, it leads people to fall back on past times as something that can be reliably good, right? You could really see it in the pandemic. That is a time that makes sense, right? People were struggling. So of course, what they want to fall back on, things that they knew worked. The Weeknd makes the 80s, influenced very retro synthwave music during that time that, like Blinding Lights and After Hours, that whole album, that's very much nostalgic, even though it's not really nostalgic to a specific time, I guess just 80s in general, but it's really just kind of the synth pop that people didn't really grow up with that were listening to it. And even then, the disco revival of the pandemic, like Dua Lipa, is the perfect example of people enjoying an artist hearkening back to a sound that they weren't really alive for, because it kind of gives them a sense of like home in art, because they didn't really have that, spending all their time home. And what I want to talk about more now is just in general people playing it safe in this way. And I want to be clear, this video is way more critical than some of the past videos I made. One of my previous videos is about Somber and Role Model, and I clarified at the end I didn't want it to be too negative because they're both young, and I believe that they can become a lot better than where they are now. These are artists I would feel like have to kind of fundamentally restructure themselves. And what I mean by that is groups like Coast Contra, Joe, Greta Van Fleet, and even Ghost sometimes. And I kind of like Ghost. I actually like some of these. I kind of like Joe sometimes. What they struggle with is originality, because what they find their musical home in is music that's not theirs. And it's very clear. Like when I'm listening to Basic Being Basic by Joe, why am I not just listening to Daft Punk is Playing at My House by LCD Sound System? You know what I mean? Why am I listening to just a worse version of that song? And the same thing with like Coast Contra. It's like, I would much rather listen to Wu-Tang. RZA's a better producer than whoever Coast Contra has. And even in the past with a group like Wolfmother that was clearly ripping off Led Zeppelin. I'm going to get into Greta Van Fleet, who is much more derivative of Led Zeppelin. But people accuse them of that, but people were still enjoying the music because they're nostalgic for that time, even though they didn't really grow up in it. You know, it's for this new audience. But Greta Van Fleet's much more direct with how they ripped off Led Zeppelin, with some instances where riffs, like I know the Rover went into their song Highway Song, I believe. That is very much like a copying, and I know that's kind of separate, but the fact that they still have a very big young audience, because I don't want to underestimate the fact that people love them. They may not be for me, but I can't deny the fact that people love them. If they love them, that's great. That's good for them. I don't want it to seem like I'm demeaning the fans because I happen to not like it. There's plenty of groups I like that fall under that. You know, like I'm a big fan of a lot of the early 2010s, late 2010s synthwave music, and especially the more new wave influenced stuff. Even if you want to count like Tori Moi or Blood Orange in there, they're very much ripping off artists. The Blood Orange is ripping off Prince so heavily, but I love Prince, so I ignore it and I give him the pass. I don't know why. I guess because I view it as quality and I think he's doing it in good taste and I think he's doing it out of love for it. What's to say that Greta Van Fleet isn't doing the same? You know, I don't know how they think. But in my mind, I still think Blood Orange is being a little more original. But there's a lot of that 2010 synthwave stuff. I'm currently really digging this album by Porcelain Raft, Strange Weekend, which is very much derivative of a lot of like Erasure, a lot of Pet Shop Boys, Depeche Mode, Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark. Like there's a lot that they're being very derivative of. I don't just want to talk about the negatives and just mention the ones I like. I want to talk about a very perfectly done nostalgia bait being Brat. That album is a nostalgia bait to all the indie sleaze stuff. And the unsuccessful version is the Dares album, because the Dares album is way too derivative. It is directly copying LCD Sound System in a way that sometimes I can suspend my disbelief and be like, you know what? I like this song. Girls is a fun song by the Dare. It is... The album is not nearly as good as any LCD Sound System album. And it feels like I'm playing pretend when I'm listening to The Dare. Whereas with Brat, it's this reference to indie sleaze that when you really look at the songs, 360 is not an indie sleaze song. Talk Talk isn't really an indie sleaze song. Sympathy is a Knife. Everything is romantic. None of these sound like indie sleaze songs. You can kind of say like something like Guess is much more indie sleaze. And there's like a influence, you know, from like Basement Jaxx and all that. Just because it's influenced by it doesn't mean it sounds like it. There's a lot of things that are influenced. Like Tyler, the Creator, is heavily influenced by the Style Council, a band that I love. But the music he makes doesn't really sound like the Style Council. But he's using their same chord progressions. The piano sounds the same. And that's where I feel like differentiator between just being nostalgia bait and giving the listener a sense of nostalgia while listening to it, it can be so artfully done. I wasn't really a fan of music during indie sleaze. I was like a baby. Like I wasn't alive for a large part of the indie sleaze stuff. For me to hear Brat and be like, this reminds me of certain artists, you know what I mean? It's bizarre. It doesn't really make sense, but it's so artfully done, it works. Whereas when I listen to The Dare, it's just like, oh, this feels very one-to-one. This is going from point A to point B and not really filling in the space in between. It's just you're stuck at the same destination. You're on the same plane instead of adding more depth. taking something from before and adding more depth. And that's where I would say I criticize a group like Greta Van Fleet, because in my mind, they're not adding that depth. They're going from point A to point B, not really filling in the space. They're just going one to one. Let's just continue this sound. The only difference is the time this is made and maybe the mics I used. You know what I mean? That's a big differentiating factor. And I know this video is kind of long, so I want to conclude this kind of short by just saying that while nostalgia bait isn't inherently wrong, I think it's important to be done intentionally, because supporting new artists is important. I don't want to act like it's not, but giving an artist time to mature can be so vital in letting them progress past this point. But when an artist finds that it's easy for them and they can get support by just making the exact music that they enjoy to listen to, which is good, it is valid, it kind of leads them to not progress, because they will naturally progress out of that and develop their own sound. Take a band like Talk Talk. It took them like 2 or 3 albums in order to start being like way more themselves, to get to something like you can't get to Spirit of Eden without having this phase of like copying like Flock of Seagulls. Thank you for watching. I know this video was long, but I truly appreciate it if you watched it all the way. Leave a like, subscribe. I make music. Check out my EP. Criticize it in the comments. Do whatever you want with it. If you find me being too picky about this stuff, sorry. If you're a fan of Greta Van Fleet, I hope I didn't offend you too much. And yeah, thanks for watching.